Who keep calm at all times, basically, which we try to do on this programme. Don't always succeed, but we will try our best today. Lots of subjects you might want to talk about: the ongoing strike situation, the Chinese balloon, the chairman of the BBC and Boris Johnson, etc., etc. The number to call: 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850, and you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC and submit your question that way.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
And, of course, you can watch us on Global Player too. Well, let's go to the first caller. It's Martin in Greenwich. Hello, Martin.
Hi.
Hello, what would you like to ask?
I'm wondering if the panel would think about the balloons in terms of geopolitics, in terms of is this an effort to get the American street to become isolationist again, to turn away from helping Ukraine in an attempt to get prize away again American dominance or the West's dominance in world affairs? As we know, China, Russia, the Arab nations to some extent are keen to do.
Well, that's a great question to start with. Nicholas Soames, let's come to you first.
Well, I think it is a very good question. And the trouble is that nobody really knows what the balloons were. That's part of the problem. And I think everyone's being fairly precious about it all because a monkey to a mousetrap, they were for intelligence gathering, almost 100% certainly. They may have had something inside them that helped detect the weather patterns or whatever, but they will undoubtedly be for listening and photographing. And everyone, China, Russia, America, Europe, have always conducted intelligence, covert intelligence operations of one way or another. My anxiety was something actually, Iain, you mentioned earlier on your programme, was that is this the sort of beginning of a new Cold War? And my real feeling is that the John Crace's book about the return of calm couldn't come at a more appropriate moment, because the language of this, when we talk about China and the Cold War now, is so extreme that it's almost impossible for politicians, in my view, to go against the flow and take the time to make a really joined-up decision. So, for example, President Biden knew perfectly well about these balloons. They did nothing about it until there was a frightful row, and the Republicans said, "You're just taking the defence of our country complacently," which was rubbish. But I'm not particularly exercised by it. What I am really exercised about is that this was clearly a chance for America and China to talk again via Anthony Blinken's supposed talks, and that, to my mind, is something that needs to happen as soon as possible.
Which, to be fair, the Chinese were very keen that meeting took place,
keen,
weren't they?
Exactly.
So, Munira, do you think that we're clutching our collective pearls at this a little bit and thinking, well, look, we all know that everybody as Nicholas said, everybody indulges in spying, whether it's overt or covert, and presumably we spy on China just as they spy on us.
Well, I mean, as Lord Soames said, nobody really knows much about
We're all on first-name terms here.
Okay. Can I call you Nicholas? Or is it Sir Nicholas? Yeah. Sorry.
Lord Nicholas. I answer to anything, actually.
All right, I'll call you Nicholas.
I do draw the line somewhere.
When I started.
I mean, we don't know a great deal. I mean, I think even in today's press briefing, the Americans were saying, it may even be a UFO or aliens or goodness knows what.
Which gives us an excuse to do a UFO phone-in at 9.
Yeah. I'll listen to that on the bus and the train home, shall I
can assure you.
So, look, I am concerned about it. I think it's part of a broader concerning pattern of behaviour that we've seen from China. We need to be very, very careful, particularly around, the surveillance technology that we allow to be used in this country, some of which is manufactured in China, and obviously the ongoing human rights abuses over there. So I think we need to be taking a pretty strong stance on China. And to your point, yes, obviously spying is always going on, but these are, balloons balloons flying over American airspace. So to some extent, I can understand why they are being quite concerned about defending their airspace. And I would expect the British government to be similarly concerned if that happened here.
Do you think we'll ever learn the truth of this as to what went on? Because it's I don't know if you used to watch X-Files, but there is a definite X-Files tinge to this.
I didn't watch X-Files,
I'm tempted
sorry.
to use a catchphrase, the truth is out there, but I'm not sure we're ever going to learn it.
No, probably not.
John, we had a caller on earlier who was reading an article in The Guardian this morning, which he was swearing by that, well, America has sent these balloons over to China and all the rest of it. Where do you think this is going to lead?
I'm not familiar with the story in the paper. I'm actually on holiday, so I've been taking time out.
So you're doing this on your holiday?
I am doing this on
very
my
boring
holiday. It's recess. But I mean, my question is, I mean, Nicholas and Munira have covered the bases well, is sort of why now? I mean, these balloons have seemed to have been in plain sight. I mean, it's not like they're so far up that you need a satellite to see them. People have been just sort of pointing to them from the ground. And so either they've been going over, flying over the whole time, and nobody has been batting an eyelid, think, oh, there goes another Chinese spying satellite.
That wouldn't be your automatic assumption. If you saw a balloon up in the air, you would think, oh, that's a Chinese balloon. Whereas, of course, now we'll all think that.
Yeah. And the other thing that I found curious is that Sir President Biden waited until the balloon was over the Atlantic in South Carolina. So he allowed the balloon to sort of fly the whole way over North America, presumably gathering loads of intelligence as it sort of made its way before shooting it down. And you would have thought that once you'd identified it as a hostile, you would have, dispensed with it sort of fairly. And I mean, there's plenty of rough ground in Montana to shoot it down over, and you're not going to land on anyone. So I'm slightly confused. I'm sort of hoping it's aliens.
Well, the wonderful thing, I mean, I normally don't entertain conspiracy theories on this programme, but I think on this subject, it's entirely reasonable to do so, because one of them may prove to be right. OK, Martin, what's your theory then?
Oh, God, I'm on... Sorry.
You're on what? I think we better... Are you there? No, I think he's indisposed for some apparent reason. Right, let's move on to another question. Let's go to David in Enfield. Hello, David.
Good evening, everyone. Does the panel think that the BBC is becoming a Conservative Party propaganda machine?
Munira.
I hope not. Look, I'm a major fan of the BBC, and I think it gets attacked from unfairly by both the left and the right. But I presume that David's talking about the whole issue around David Sharp and his appointment. And
Richard
Sharp. My apologies. It's David as the caller. Richard Sharp. And of course, the report that came out yesterday from the committee was pretty damning about him not declaring the loan he'd helped organise for Boris Johnson before his appointment. But I think what troubles me about this whole story is, obviously we need to look at what he did or didn't declare, and there needs to be proper transparency. But nobody's really talking about Boris Johnson's role in this particular story, and I think there needs to be a proper investigation by the ethics advisor into his role in this whole situation.
What are you accusing him of?
Well, I mean, the fact that he was involved in appointing Richard Sharp to this role after asking him to help, broker this meeting.
I don't think he did ask him to broker the meeting. I think Richard Sharp offered to say to his very, very distant cousin that he would effect an introduction.
But I think we need transparency on all sides. So it's fair enough to say Richard Sharp should have been transparent about it. I think the former Prime Minister should also have done so.
I mean, it's not unusual for a Prime Minister of whatever party to appoint somebody who supports that particular party to chair the BBC.
Yeah.
Tony Blair did it with Gavin Davies back in the day, didn't he? So,
and absolutely, and that's why
lots of other
transparency in declaring all interests is so critical, because it is true that, I mean, personally, I think that we should probably try to move away from that and maybe have some sort of independent process going forward. But yes, to your point...
Well, he did have to be interviewed, didn't he? I mean, he wasn't just Boris Johnson saying, I'd like Richard Sharp to be chairman. There was an interview process.
No, indeed. And then there was the select committee hearing process, and the select committee is saying we weren't given all the information we should have done, which is a pretty damning verdict, I think.
John Crace, propaganda machine for the Tory party, the BBC.
Well, I was actually last Tuesday in the committee room when the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport had a sort of post-appointment briefing with him. And there are clearly a lot of questions that sort of went unanswered. And I don't think whether it's not so much that the BBC has become a wing of the sort of Conservative Party. I think that what we saw is we got an insight into how Britain works and how the establishment works. And it was clearly a fix. Somebody had a word with somebody who had a word with somebody else, and all these things there was no transparency of process to any of it. And with Richard Sharp, we got, he quite fancied being chairman all of a sudden. So
Who wouldn't?
So he goes along and has a quick word with Boris Johnson because he's pals with Boris Johnson.
Well, I think he was working in Downing Street at the time, so it'd be difficult to avoid him, I suppose. But...
Well, it depends how much work you think Boris actually did there.
No, I meant Richard Sharp was working in Downing Street.
But I mean, he has a word with him, and then by all accounts, other people were discouraged from applying because Richard was seen as the right sort of chap. And he was the right sort of chap who had, in a previous life, donated £10,000 to the Conservative Party, who had also happened to be Rishi Sunak's boss at Goldman Sachs. It was all just incredibly cosy.
And if Boris had known that, he'd have never appointed him.
And we've also got the sort of unanswered question, because Simon Case, the cabinet secretary, wrote a memo to Boris saying, you have got to stop asking Richard Sharp for financial advice. And quite understandably, Damien Green, the committee chairman, asked Richard Sharp about this and said he'd never given Boris any financial advice at all. So we've got two conflicting stories, neither of which...
I wonder why they haven't summoned Boris Johnson to give evidence on this, because presumably it's within their power to do so.
Well, it's getting hard enough to get him to go to the Privileges Committee.
OK, Nicholas Soames, do you think the BBC is becoming a Conservative Party propaganda
I entirely
machine?
agree with Munira that, the BBC is a whipping boy for both the left and the right. But I clearly do not believe that the BBC is a sort of propaganda agency of the Conservative Party. Actually, if anything else, it's the other way around. That's certainly what any Conservative will tell you. But the trouble with this debate is that it's slightly lost all sense of proportion, really. And I take the point that John's made about it all being too cosy. I mean, the trouble is that Prime Ministers tend to appoint, when jobs come up, people who they think will do it well. And, let's be clear, Richard Sharp is a very considerable person, extremely capable, very clever. He'd been a brilliant banker. He was interested in public service, which is not true of everyone. And was prepared to, let it obviously be known by the sign of it that he wanted to be chairman of the BBC. I'm not party to any of that. But there is a process, and I know that governments always hide behind process, but they have to on this occasion. And the Appointments Commission are going to have to say what exactly it was that went wrong. I mean, if he willfully didn't declare, or was it willfully not asked, the question? I don't know. I mean, I don't know what question you have to ask to make everyone to do this. Because on the form of applying for a public job, there are very extensive, extremely impertinent questions which you are obliged to ask, which you're obliged to answer. So I can't see where this problem actually sort of materialised itself.
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see where it goes from here, because I think sometimes you get the sense whenever there's a whiff of a scandal, in inverted commas, you can kind of think, well, I know what the outcome of this is going to be, whether it's tomorrow or whether it's in 3 weeks' time. On this one, I don't sort of get a feeling as to where it's going to end. But
can I
very quickly,
just very briefly? I mean, from what I can see, the real problem is that at some point, Richard said to Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, I've helped arrange this loan. Do you think I need to mention this to the appointment hearing? And Simon Case said, no, you've mentioned it to me, so you don't need to mention it to anyone.
well, he's in the clear then, isn't he? But Simon Case isn't.
No. Well, yeah, I mean, yeah. But, I mean, it still doesn't...
Did the loan actually happen? Do we know that?
We don't know. We also don't know why Boris is quite so hard up.
Well, I don't think he is now, but he was then. Anyway, we are going to move on and take some more of your questions in just a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
Real. 21 minutes past 8 on LBC. We were just being treated to the views of Nicholas Soames on various of our LBC presenters. Just as well. We're in a break, I think. Munira Wilson is also here, Lib Dem MP for Twickenham and the party's education spokesperson, and John Crace, Parliamentary sketch writer for The Guardian and author of the book of Farewell to Calm, The New Normal Survival Guide. Fascinating title. Tell us a bit about it.
Well, it's actually the third in a series of collections of my political sketches. Yep. And I sort of never really started out to have one, but Theresa May sort of presented herself as the starting block. And then politics, I don't know what it was like for both Nicholas and Munira, sort of on the inside, but certainly from watching from the press gallery, I mean, it was sort of like watching the sort of House of Commons have a sort of collective breakdown.
It was.
And it was so politics just seemed to keep coming at you. I mean, I can remember when I started in the job, I mean, nothing would seem to happen for days, weeks on end.
You'd have to write complete sketches about Michael Fabricant's hair.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you would have to sort of, which does seem to grow, which is really odd.
I think he's got 3 different ones, hasn't he?
Yeah, I think so.
Before I libel him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, I was waiting for you to do that rather than me.
Thanks.
And then I wrote a second one, which was a book called Decline and Fail, which saw the end of Theresa May. And, that was the tempestuous bits with, all those late night Brexit debates when it felt...
Halcyon days.
Yeah, when sort of... fairly kind of normal, moderate members of the Conservative Party found themselves on the opposition benches. I mean, that must have been extraordinary times.
I don't think, Nicholas, you went quite that far, did you?
No,
you must have felt
quite that far, but I had the whip withdrawn from it by the Prime Minister for the perfectly understandable reason, actually, that I refused to vote for his... to leave to go for Brexit in the hard Brexit.
Yeah.
But I would just tell you, I think it's such a good thing to have written like that, because it was, Munira, it was poisonously ghastly, the 5 years that led up to Brexit. It was unbearable. It set colleague against colleague. It set constituency against constituency, and it did have, the country had, in my view, a collective nervous breakdown. I think we have to be very careful about the use of language, and it felt very rough at the time, very rough and very unpleasant.
What would you have thought the 2019 election if all of that hadn't happened?
Well, it's a very good question. I think I'd probably reached... I think I was time expired anyway. But
we didn't.
No. I think I was.
John certainly didn't.
I remember sketching you with affection.
Yes, you've always been very kind to me. I've done long enough. I did 35 years, and talk about bed blockers. I really was a bed blocker, and it needed. But it merely absolutely reconfirmed to me whatever decision I might have made. It made it absolutely sure that I simply wasn't, because I didn't feel it was my House of Commons anymore. I didn't feel that we'd arrived at a sensible conclusion in a sensible way, and that I didn't think Parliament was really doing its job.
Should we go to another question?
Yes, I think
Stacey is in Wallington. She sent in a text question. London bus drivers have been given an 18% pay rise. Is this what everyone else in the public sector should now expect? Well, of course, they're technically not in the public sector because they're employed by a private sector company. There's 1,800 drivers who work for Abellio, driving on routes mainly around southwest London. They've accepted this pay offer today. Well, I bet they have. after strikes by members of Unite. Well, I wonder, John, whether you think that is going to set a bit of a trend. And it's interesting that the private sector is offering that kind of pay rise, but the public sector isn't.
Well, I mean, it's certainly going to throw the cat amongst the pigeons, isn't it? Because the mantra for the government is that just no one has that amount of money to pay. And suddenly, if an 18% pay rise is on the cards somewhere, people are going to look very carefully at what may be available. But I mean, I think in the wider thing, I don't think the nurses are expecting 19% for a second. What they are hoping for and expecting is some kind of compromise in the middle of about 8 or 9%, which after a 20% real-term pay cut since 2010, I think most of the country would go along for. And the idea that the government could not borrow to pay these pay rises is absurd. Governments can always find money when they want to. During the COVID pandemic, they obviously found money for furlough that they didn't know was there. They didn't expect to have to find, but they managed to find it. So, the money is there if the flesh is willing.
I suppose the argument against... Well, actually, let Nicholas put the argument against that, assuming that he is going to argue against that.
No, I am. And of course, Ian's quite right. It's a private company. It's a private business. They can offer what they want to get their people back to work. But it is breaking the government's guidance very seriously. And clearly there isn't the money to pay. And I agree with you, John. I don't think the nurses are expecting anything like that. They want and I do get the impression that they would like to settle, and I do think it's very difficult for the government just to go on digging its toes in. Yeah. But the fact is that the financial position in this country is very serious, and coupled with high inflation. And, when I first came into Parliament in 1983, Lady Thatcher was fighting a great battle against inflation, and we won it, and it was absolutely fundamental to the success of the economy thereafter. So if we do get these very big pay rises, there is no doubt they will damage the economy. None at all.
Munira?
Well, for a start, it sounds like my constituents are going to be able to get a bus again. Because earlier you said they serve South West London. Yeah. There's been the strikes have been affecting a lot of the routes in my constituency. I don't think it's realistic to expect the government to award inflation-busting pay rises to every part of the public sector. But let's not forget, like the nurses, bus drivers were working every single day through COVID. Many of them got sick. They were getting a lot of our key workers to work. But no, like Nicholas, I think the main thing is the government needs to get back around the table and get negotiating with the unions, whether it's our nurses or ambulance drivers, or whether it's teachers, so that patients can get the treatment they need and our kids can keep learning.
The trouble is that when they do make offers, they seem to be automatically rejected. They've made another one to the RMT, which has been rejected again. They're balloting their members for more strikes in March, I think. And that there is this mantra that they're not getting around the table. They must be to be making more offers.
Well, I don't think they have with the nurses, and certainly with the teachers. They're not talking about looking at this year, and they haven't even entered into some of the discussions around next year. And I would argue, actually, that the process for teachers, for instance, is not particularly independent. For instance, the Secretary of State decides who sits on the board, what the remit is, what the funding envelope is, and whether to accept the recommendation. So there's whole challenges around the process. But aside from that, from what I understand, for example, with teachers, the Secretary of State and other ministers haven't entered into any discussions around the current situation, and teachers have seen their pay, drop massively in real terms, as well as having to deal with massive pressures on the budget in schools that is making day-to-day teaching and the quality of the education that our children are receiving, it is being damaged every day.
Right, a couple of texts and tweets here. A tweet here from somebody who says, the first thing Margaret Thatcher did when she got into power was give the public sector a 25% pay rise, because I think she did accept the public sector review board,
agreed by the Labour Party. Yeah.
And going back to our discussion on the balloon, Paul in Cambridgeshire says, I'm currently monitoring your programme from my spaceship above the LBC building in London. I'm going to open my window and shout out, I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. Trouble is, we won't be able to hear you, Paul, because we're not in the LBC building in London. No. We're at 4 Millbank, so sorry. And John says, tell your guests that there is no intelligence in South Carolina. I think as I mentioned to you, for you there, John. I've been there, says John. More of your questions in a moment. Keep the calls coming. 0345 6060 973. Time for the news headlines on LBC at 8:31 with Serena Farrow.
The US says China is operating a high-altitude balloon program. A White House briefing has followed the shooting down of 4 objects in the airspace in North America. A former Met police officer has admitted 3 counts of indecent exposure just weeks before he murdered Sarah Everard. Wayne Couzens is serving a whole life sentence for killing her. And members of the Unite Union who work for a bus company in London have agreed to be paid £18 an hour. It means the 1,800 bus drivers have now called off industrial action after accepting the improved pay offer. LBC weather: rain in Northern Ireland and moving over to southwest Scotland by the end of tonight. Clear elsewhere though, with patchy fog, particularly in the southeast, and a low of -1 degree.
This is LBC.
.35 is the time on LBC. You're listening to or watching Cross Question on Global Player. With us are Nicholas Soames, Conservative peer, former Armed Forces Minister, Munira Wilson, Liberal Democrat MP for Twickenham and the party's education spokesperson, and John Crace, Parliamentary sketch writer for The Guardian, and his book is called A Farewell to Calm, The New Normal Survival Guide. Right, let's go to another caller. It's Chris in Richmond, one of your constituents, Munira. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Ian and Munira panel. Does the panel agree with me that the Home Secretary's divisive rhetoric on asylum seekers, as well as that of certain other Conservative politicians, is partly to blame for what happened in Merseyside on Friday?
Just explain what happened in Merseyside on Friday.
Well, violent scenes, a police van torched and people basically protesting outside a location where asylum seekers were staying.
Just to follow up on that, Nicholas, this does seem to be a bit of a problem when you have one or two Conservative MPs doing videos outside hotels where asylum seekers are being put up. Now, you can't necessarily directly draw a link to this, but I'm thinking of one or two in particular that if something happened in the hotels in their constituency, you could easily say, well, if you hadn't done that video, that wouldn't have happened.
Yeah. Well, I think, as I said earlier, I think people will have to be very careful with their use of language in these very sensitive situations. I really do. And I have no idea what the Home Secretary is alleged to have said, but every Home Secretary is accused of saying something wrong before a demonstration of that sort. So I don't suppose that the current one is any...
Well, I think it's her rhetoric more generally, I think.
Yes, well, I think it is essential to keep the rhetoric on immigration in this country calm and sensible. We've got to have a discussion about it, and we have to have a debate about it, but it has to be done in a pragmatic and sensible way, and not in a way in which... It's rather like the foreign policy thing we do about China. I mean, the atmosphere is so toxic that you can't get anywhere with anything. There's no space to move. So I think people do have to be very cautious with their use of language.
You served in Parliament with Suella Braverman. Do you think she's suitable to be Home Secretary?
Well, she's the appointed Home Secretary. I don't know her really at all. But she, I don't know her. I'm afraid I don't know.
Okay, Munira.
Do you want me to answer that last question?
You can
the first
answer
question. Do I think she's suitable to be Home Secretary?
Let's go to Chris's question.
To Chris's question. Well, first of all, I think we need to condemn.
Because you need to give him an answer, otherwise he won't vote for you.
Don't worry, Chris. I will give you an answer. I just want to condemn completely the violence that we saw on Friday night, and thank the emergency services. I think there was a police officer or an ambulance or a paramedic who was injured. Our emergency services putting themselves at risk to deal with this. Do I believe that Suella Braverman's rhetoric and the wider Conservative government rhetoric over asylum and immigration in recent years has contributed? I think undoubtedly it has. I think when you've got people in positions of leadership, and particularly as senior as the Home Secretary, talking about people in the small boats coming over the Channel as invading our shores, and that was the word that she used in the House of Commons some weeks back. She talked about invasion. I do think that is inflammatory, and I think, when, as Nicholas has said, this is a sensitive issue, and communities are feeling sensitive about the fact that asylum seekers are being put up in hotels in their communities, to then have a Home Secretary and a government that is using that kind of language that has fostered this hostile environment for asylum seekers and immigrants in this country over many years, undoubtedly, I think that has contributed to some of the sorts of flashpoints that we've seen, as well as MPs doing videos in front of these hotels or getting up and talking about where some of these hotels are in the House of Commons, which I think is deeply, deeply irresponsible.
John?
I'd pretty much endorse what Munira's just said. I think two things. First of all, there is the use of language, as Nicholas also said. She is the Home Secretary who said she dreamt of full flights to Rwanda. That is not particular. That is not a compassionate, informed, or trying to sort of manage the debate. And also, don't forget that even Liz Truss thought that Suella Braverman wasn't fit to be Home Secretary because she effectively fired her for a breach of the Ministerial Code. One of the few times when the Ministerial Code actually seems to mean something, but back then it did. And I think there was general astonishment that Rishi Sunak would reappoint her just 6 days after she was forced to resign. And one does sort of wonder about his sort of choice of appointments, whether he is quite the safe pair of hands that the Tory party was hoping for.
Well, it's appointed Lee Anderson as deputy chairman, so what more can you want? What more can you want?
As a sketch writer, it has been absolutely ideal.
Did you inwardly cheer when you heard that appointment?
Oh, yes. I can't deny it. The next day, I did my Lee Anderson manifesto for Britain, which some Guardian readers unfortunately took as the real thing.
Chris, brief response from you?
I completely agree with all of the panel, frankly. It is appalling to see what's happened. I'm going to Germany tomorrow for work, and I just remind myself of what the AfD have done And what's happened, in the 1930s, we have to be very careful, right? Or we're going to be in a very dark place again. So I think the Home Secretary needs to apologise. Conservative politicians have to stop posting these ridiculous videos. And everyone needs to calm down and focus on the problem, which is not processing the claims quick enough, which I think is really only the way to solve this issue.
Chris, has Munira still got your vote?
Of course.
Yeah.
Oh, there you
Job
are.
done.
I feel we've performed a public service by taking that question and cheering Munira up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, let's do a text question from Jonathan in Staithes in North Yorkshire, who says, Ben Wallace says, Zelensky is like a modern-day Winston Churchill. Does your panel think he really deserves such a moniker? Grandson of Winston Churchill, Nicholas Soames.
Well, he has exhibited the most formidable gifts of leadership and courage in an exemplary way at a time of extraordinary danger for his country, and I think he's nothing short of remarkable. And I just think that every now and again a country gets thrown up at the right time in very difficult circumstances, the right person. And this man, after all, was a comedian.
Yeah.
And then you watch him in Westminster Hall the other day. It was the most astonishing display, really wonderful and powerful and moving. And so I think he has many great leadership qualities, most of all courage.
See, I think he's also learnt from what your grandfather did in 1940, 1941, when his main aim was to persuade America to support us. I mean, he wanted them to come into the war, which obviously they did at the end of 1941. But he went over to America to persuade Roosevelt that it was in America's interest to supply us with armaments. That's exactly what Zelensky is now doing
exactly
his little European tour last week, wasn't it?
Yeah. Absolutely clear. It's exactly what he does. And I know one of your earlier questions was about the, you were mentioning about the aeroplanes. I mean, he and one of your correspondents was saying, this is what happened with the tanks. They went on and on and on, and eventually they got the tanks. I think the aeroplanes are a different thing, but he's absolutely, you can see, determined to get that fixed. But the trouble is about Zelensky is that he is completely, not the trouble is, I mean, one of his greatest strengths is he's completely single-minded. He's sort of like de Gaulle. And, I don't think that he realises, well, he does realise, but I think he doesn't quite understand how difficult it would be to give a weapon that would be utterly game-changing and would undoubtedly involve an Article 5.
You were a minister in the Ministry of Defence for many years. If you were there now advising the Prime Minister on what to do in response to that request, what would you be saying?
I'd say follow exactly what Ben Wallace has been doing. I think Ben Wallace has done an unbelievably good job as Secretary of State for Defence. I think his vision and understanding of the essential nature of getting as many weapons and ammunition and training to them as we possibly can is completely correct, and he's done it very well. But, I mean, there is a major problem for our defence in that, the cupboard is bare, and we have given all our ammunition. Most of our missiles have all gone to the Ukraine, and the government must now take very seriously this problem of building up our reserves again, because, first of all, if we don't, we won't have any more to give the Ukrainians, and we need exact amounts for ourselves.
What a great time to start up an arms manufacturer, John.
Yes.
Business opportunity there.
Well, yeah, there's one way to solve our Brexit crisis, isn't it? Hit to GDP, let's all sort of start producing fighter jets. No, but I completely agree with Nicholas on Zelensky. I was in Westminster Hall as well and it was the most extraordinary speech, because I've seen quite a few overseas heads of states come over and address Parliament. And, they're always sort of very nice, complimentary, and they're never less than grand occasions. But Zelensky had there was an urgency to what he was saying, and he was there on a mission. It was sort of like Bob Geldof at Live Aid, except instead of give us the expletive money, it was give us the expletive planes. And you know, the great thing is that he had 650 MPs and about 800 peers cheering him on, which is going to make it really difficult for Rishi Sunak to say no now.
Munira?
Well, I agree with what Nicholas said about his courage and his resilience, which is... We've seen that from the Ukrainian people, but it's been manifested through President Zelensky's leadership. And like John, I was in Westminster Hall, and it was an incredibly moving moment. He certainly knows how to work a room. He's a fantastic leader on planes. You know, we should continue to be full square behind Ukraine's efforts, and I think we need to work in lockstep with our allies, and therefore it's up to Rishi Sunak now to be talking to the US, the EU, and other partners about how we can support the requests going forward. We can't do it on our own.
We do. It isn't an easy matter. The tank issue. I mean, when I was a soldier, I was in the Royal Armoured Corps. My regiment had Chieftain tanks, which is the predecessor to the Challenger. They are very complicated pieces of kit, and the Ukrainians are brilliant at it and learn very, very quickly. But the actual logistics of fueling up every night, resupplying ammunition to 3 different types of tanks, the Challenger, the Abrams and the Leopard, is a very, very real thing. And if they get the F-16 fighter, of course the argument about flying, the pilots will fly them very quickly, but actually keeping those aeroplanes in the air and keeping the weapons flow going is incredibly complicated.
Right, we'll come to more of your questions in a moment. It's 8:47.
This is LBC.
It's 8:51. Nicholas Soames, Munira Wilson and John Crace with me answering your questions. The next one is from Margaret in Durham. Hello, Margaret.
Hello. How are you, Ian?
Hi. I'm very well, thank you. What would you like to ask?
Good. I am perplexed. I've wanted to ask this for some time. Is it a prerequisite to become a member of the Conservative cabinet? You must be extremely rich and privately educated. Are these requisites before appointment?
Well, how do you define extremely rich?
Richer than me. Anything richer than me. Not that many rich people, and some are millionaires. That's what I mean.
Well,
you know what I mean exactly.
No,
Yeah,
I do know what you mean,
on.
but I've just looked up a list of all the cabinet ministers, and I can identify 3 that I would know for a fact to be extremely rich, i.e. multimillionaires, and they would be Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Hunt and Andrew Mitchell. Although I think after his Plebgate case, that's possibly not the case any longer. But I mean, there are lots in there that I know for a fact are not rich. But do you just get the impression that they all are?
Yes, I do. Maybe it's the way they talk.
You see, maybe Nicholas Soames, that is the reason that you weren't in the cabinet. You just weren't rich enough.
Well, that's certainly true. But I'm Margaret. Good evening. I must disagree with you on this grounds only. My great friend Gillian Keegan, who is the Secretary of State for Education, left school at 16, became an apprentice on the Ford training course, worked her way through university and goodness knows what else, and made a great success of her life entirely by her own endeavours, and thus, in my view, brings to the table a great deal of invaluable experience. But I don't think it's, wrong to have rich people in the cabinet any more than it's wrong to have poor people in the cabinet. What you want is people who have got judgment and good sense and experience, and I hope a sensible view of the world and a very good intention to do the right thing for their fellow citizens. I don't think money's got anything to do with it, and nor, as a matter of fact, does education. I mean, I wish that all education was brilliant in Britain, and the fact that it's not all education is not necessarily brilliant is not to our credit.
Where did you go to school?
I went to Eton.
Rather playing into Margaret's hands. Munira.
Yeah, but I'm not rich.
Munira, where did you go to school?
Where did I go to school? I went to a state grammar school.
Eton?
No, no. I went to
grammar.
the Henrietta Barnett School for Girls in Hampstead Garden suburb in North London.
Sounds very posh.
But it's a state school.
But this thing about sort of rich people. I mean, the tone of what Margaret was saying, essentially, well, that there should be a quota or something, so there can't be too many rich people. But you look at Jeremy Hunt. I mean, self-made. I mean, he started a company. It did really well, and he's made money because of it. Is that a crime nowadays?
Well, no. Look, as a liberal, I have no problem with people making money and being politicians. Just like I have no problem, as Nicholas said, if somebody is from a much more modest background, making it to high office. For me, what should be the criteria to hold any public office is competency, decency, and good, ethics and integrity. And sadly, I think we see a lot of those qualities as lacking in the current cabinet, and I'd say that's far more important than their bank balance or where they went to school.
John?
I'm going to sort of slightly play devil's advocate here, because I've got a slight sympathy for Rishi Sunak here, because we have poor old Rishi. He's made a lot of money, but when he goes home and says, "I've made 20 million quid this week," his wife goes, "So what?" Because her dad is worth billions, she's worth 750 million, and 20 million quid is sort of just a week's work.
Well, he's showing willing, isn't he?
It's showing willing. It's sort of, what are you bringing to the table? But you're 20 million, it's not much.
I think that's unfair, John. I really do. I mean, I don't think
it's the
you
job
find
of a sketch writer to be unfair.
Of course it is, but you're not. And where I take it, I mean, what Rishi Sunak's wife has or has not is not our business. But Rishi Sunak, in his own right, is a very successful man who's done. I want my government and the government of this country to be really clever, successful people who have an understanding, a profound understanding of what they're doing, and coupled with what Munira quite rightly says about decency and ethics and all the rest of it. But I would also say slightly, Munira, I think we're being slightly, Parliament has gone through a rough time in the last few years. But Parliament does represent the country pretty well. And, I'm afraid that there are a fair number of shysters in Parliament.
Name them.
And there are a fair number of shysters in the country.
Well, you couldn't have said that if you were still an MP, could you? Especially if you said they were in your constituency. Right, this is a very difficult question to answer in 30 seconds, but I'm going to have to ask you to. It's a tweet question from Mihal in County Down. What should the consequences be if the DUP presents a speaker being elected in the Northern Ireland Assembly again tomorrow? Now, MLAs are meeting to try to pass an organ donor law to help a 6-year-old boy who's waiting for a heart transplant. The DUP says it will not be dropping its Northern Ireland Protocol-inspired boycott of the Assembly. John Crace.
Do you know, this is such a complicated... I really don't know the answer to this.
We don't often get people saying that on the programme, but I always respect it when someone does.
Thank you.
You're ceding your time to the other two, basically. Munira.
I think I'm a similar boat to John, but I mean, I don't know whether there is any way they can press ahead. Northern Ireland desperately needs a functioning government, not just for...
So do you think it's time for the government to say, OK, there'll be an election then?
I think so.
Nicholas?
I think the government should act, yeah.
OK, right. Final question, very different one, from Stephen Telford. Following the announcement that Lilt is to be scrapped, what drink could the panel not survive without? I'm in high dudgeon over this because I'm an addict of Lilt. In fact, I had a bottle of it on the way down from Norfolk today.
It's quite retro, though, isn't it?
It is quite retro, but it still has a totally tropical taste. Munira?
Fresh orange juice.
Fresh orange juice. That's very virtuous. Nicholas, I think I know what you're going to say.
Dark Coke.
Oh, really? No, that's not what I thought you were going to say.
Though I am repelled by the decision to get rid of Lilt.
That's just currying favour.
Yeah.
John?
It's got to be Diet Coke for me. I haven't drunk alcohol for 35 years. We gave each other up. I'm not sure who got there first, but it was a mutually assured destruction.
Yes.
And
Diet Coke
has
saved the day.
Saved the day. Yeah.
Isn't there Coke Zero as well?
I don't
know. Nor do I.
I don't like
too sweet.
Diet Coke is absolutely the real thing.
I have Fanta Zero.
Oh,
but apparently what they're doing is they're doing an Opal Fruits and Starburst thing. They're going to rebadge Lilt as Fanta
Tropical
something or other. Yeah.
And this is a remark that's guaranteed to infuriate Margaret and Durham, but I actually prefer my Pims made with Fanta lemonade light.
No, it's got to be cloudy lemonade.
Sadly,
It's gotta be
Margaret
cloudy
has departed us, otherwise I'll get her back on. Thank you very much indeed, Nicholas Soames, Munira Wilson and John Crace. Now, fasten your seatbelts, because the US Air Force General overseeing North American airspace said yesterday, after a series of shoot-downs of unidentified objects, that he would not rule out aliens or other explanation yet, deferring to US intelligence experts. He would not rule out UFOs or aliens. Would you? 0345 6060 973. The truth is out there. We're going to find it over the next hour. Have you ever seen a UFO? Have you ever had an out-of-body experience? Have you felt as if you're the equivalent of Mulder and Scully? Now's the time to tell me. 0345 6060 973. I think these three want to stay on.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's